Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be my 2017 year in review. According to Goodreads, I read 202 books in 2017. I think that's probably a bit off because I had 1 week where, for some reason, the app and the website were not syncing properly, and a number of my books ended up appearing as ×2 at the bottom, so they were double counted. But I also don't count my rereads, so that's actually probably fairly close to the real number. In my 2018 goals video, I mentioned that statistically I had read approximately 2/3 fiction to 1/3 nonfiction, and about 2/3 standard prose to 1/3 comic style books. I always enjoy watching people's statistics videos about the types of authors they're reading and the types of books they're reading, but I don't like to break my genres down too much, just because in a lot of cases I'm not necessarily sure whether something falls into one or another. There are a lot of, for example, science fiction comics that I read which could arguably go into a category that is science fiction or that is superhero, and which is which. Similarly with fantasy, science fiction, similarly in March, I did March Mystery Madness, so I was reading almost entirely mysteries, and there were a few books in there that I read where I don't actually know if they're in the cozy mystery category, because the content is maybe slightly harsher than a cozy mystery should be, and trying to separate those out is a little too exact, so unfortunately I can't pull up numbers like that. And actually the same thing with, I see a lot of people do bits where they talk about author nationality or gender. And again, because I read a lot of comic books which have multiple authors, I don't know how to classify books like that. For example, if I'm reading a book that has a Chilean-French writer and a Chinese artist, would you classify that as Chilean or French or Chinese, or all three? I don't know. And similarly, a lot of times there'll be a female writer and a male artist, or vice versa, and so I don't pull stats like that, unfortunately. Anyway, let's talk about some books. I read a lot of memoirs this year, and I think two of the ones that really stand out to me were Basharat Peer's Curfewed Nights. The subheading on this one is One Kashmiri Journalist's Frontline Account of Life, Love, and the War in His Homeland. As that implies, the author is a journalist based in Delhi who is originally from Kashmir and was eventually sent to Kashmir to report. And as a reporter, he had access to both official channels, and as a local, he had access to a lot of locals who were willing to talk to him in a way that they wouldn't have probably talked to an outside journalist. And it is just absolutely heartbreaking. I think Kashmir is one of those places where we have a notion that there is a lot of communal violence there, and that there are military disputes going on there, both in terms of independence movements and in terms of actions between India and Pakistan. And yeah, this really puts a human face on all of that. And I thought this was incredibly well done. The only complaint that I had about this was the font of the actual physical book, which is terrible. But yeah, I thought this was brilliant. And I mean, I read this in the first half of the year, and I still think about this. Another memoir that I thought stands out, although for slightly different reasons, was Kenan Trebincevic's The Bosnia List, which, as you can imagine from the author's name and the title, is his memoir of growing up in Bosnia during the war there, and he eventually moved to the US as a refugee. He is not a writer. This is not one of those memoirs that somebody churns out after they've written a novel, and he's not a journalist. This is a guy who's a physiotherapist, and he's very much a kind of bro. And he has that kind of macho voice that you don't see, because I think a lot of writers don't have that kind of macho voice, because he's not a writer, that's not the career that he's in. And I thought that was really interesting to see. Like, there's a scene early on where he is at a club with people from other areas in the Balkans, and there's so much macho posturing that it genuinely reminded me of people I know who would never write a memoir, but whose experiences are interesting. So I really liked the uniqueness of the voice to this. So that was great. I also listened to a number of memoirs on audio, especially with celebrity memoirs. I often prefer to listen to them on audio, but unfortunately a lot of the ones this year I didn't have great experiences with, and not necessarily because they weren't good. In a couple of cases, I think it was more about the context. For example, just a couple of months ago, I listened to Alan Cumming's memoir, Not My Father's Son, and it was a really touching story and he performs it well. But about a quarter of it is about the story of his grandfather that was covered in the TV series Who Do You Think You Are? And I've seen his episode, so I know what happened with his grandfather. So that part was a little redundant, and it brought down my overall impression of the book. Similarly, right at the beginning of the year, I listened to Trevor Noah's Born a Crime, which he reads to great effect. And if you're looking to pick that up, really listen to the audio, because it's worth it just for the accents, because you get so much more information, because there are some people who pop in and out, people like security guards or teachers, and the text doesn't give you background information about them. But because he's doing the accent, you know additional things, because that tells you something about their class and ethnicity and whatnot that you wouldn't have otherwise. So I did think it was brilliant that way. But a lot of it covered material that's been covered in his comedy before, and especially comparing some of the stuff about his time living with his grandmother and some of the stuff, especially from his Daywalker show. It's such similar material that I found myself listening to it and thinking, well, which version of that story is the true story? And that was very distracting, because it really is similar versions of the same thing. And of course, memory works that way. We're always rewriting memory. So on the one hand, it makes sense that the stories aren't the same. On the other hand, I couldn't help but think about that, since they're both recordings. I'd actually be curious if you read or listened to that book and you've also heard his more autobiographical shows. I'd be curious to know what you thought of that and if you felt the same way, because I did find that quite distracting. Moving out of memoirs and into just standard nonfiction, the book that I think stood out for me the most was Kapka Kassabova's Border, A Journey to the Edge of Europe, which is her tour, basically, among the different areas in Thrace. So in Bulgaria, in northern Greece, in northern Turkey, and interviewing people whose families have been over various borders over the centuries, and a lot about population movement and politics. And it puts a very human face on an area that I think is hit by a lot of nationalism, and that shifting politics have really hit hard. And I think especially if you have notions of, especially the 1923 population exchanges there, and they're based on nationalism, whether it's Greek nationalism or Turkish nationalism or anything else. I think this is an interesting book to read because it says a lot about the commonalities that are behind those kind of stories. I feel a little weird that I'm not mentioning any of the giant ton of neuroscience books that I read this year, but with a lot of them, I feel like they had very interesting bits, but I didn't feel like any of them were particularly exceptional on their own. The one that kind of set me off going with it was Luke Dittrich's Patient HM, which was interesting, but I think had some structural issues in that he was interweaving the biography of Patient HM with the history of psychosurgery, developments in neuroscience, developments in psychological experimentation involving people, and his own family story that didn't quite hit the balance, but that really was what got me thinking and asking more questions about the human mind. So I think I should probably mention it just for that. And I think crossing the line between nonfiction and more artistic writing, my favorite poetry collection of the year was one that I read right at the end of the year, and that's Cheng Thom's A Place Called No Homeland, which is an interesting collection of poetry centering around identity, both in terms of second and third generation immigrant communities, and also gender identity and sexuality. But the really exceptional part of this to me was the use of spacing and dashes and page placement to get you to read this in the way that I think spoken word poetry works. Because there is a lot of poetry that I think works when it's performed and not necessarily when it's written, or vice versa. But the spacing in this really bridges that gap in a way that kind of blew me away, and I was incredibly impressed with this. It's only been a couple of weeks since I've read it, so I can't say how I'm going to feel about it in 6 months, but it definitely, I thought, was incredibly impressive. And then moving over into novels, I read 3 of Sebastian Barry's novels almost back to back, 3 months in a row. The first one was The Temporary Gentleman, which is about one of the McNulty family members. It's set across the 20th century. It ends in Ghana after it's become independent. And it is narrated by a man who is incredibly detached from other people and incredibly detached from his own family, and does incredible damage to his wife and his children because he's so detached. And it was a really interesting voice. I didn't think this was one of the best books that I read, but I thought it was really interesting because after that I read On Canan's Side, which is about the other family that Sebastian Barry writes about. It was about an Irish woman, also covering the 20th century, who, on the flip side, rather than being someone who acts, has the actions of others and their being touched by political and military events are basically crushing her as she goes through her life. The framing device in this book is that her grandson has just committed suicide, so she, at 80, is planning her own suicide. And what happens is there are all of these men in her life, her first husband and her second husband and her son and her grandson, who keep being hit by things like the Irish independence struggle, and then racial segregation in the United States, and then the American War in Vietnam, and then the original American Gulf War. External forces acting on her family that is ruining her life, more or less. And then finally I read his newest one, which was Days Without End. Is also about an Irish immigrant, but this time someone who immigrates to the United States during the potato famine, and has a really interesting narrative voice. It's so stylized and very charming in such a way that it almost convinces you that he must be telling you the truth. And so I've seen a lot of reviews that talk about this in terms of it being a love story and a family story, and how his relationship with his partner and their adopted daughter. And it was funny because my initial reaction to that book was that it was about genocide, and that it was about how someone who isn't given a lot of choices in life may end up, as this character does, in a military unit during the American Indian Wars, and he is very early on part of a unit that commits an act that is not even a questionable act. It is full out, they're murdering women and children in their sleep. Clear war crime. And much of what happens after that leads from that. The fact that they have this adopted daughter who's a Lakota girl, the reason she is not with her biological family is because her biological family has been killed by units like his doing the things that he has done. And it's not explored because he's not exploring it. But I think there's a lot of implicit exploration of that elsewhere. It tempts people to think, yeah, listen to this guy talking about his beautiful beau and his lovely daughter. And wait. These are not necessarily good people. I mean, sure, he was following orders, but I don't think we think that's an excuse, do we? So I thought that was really brilliant. I don't have that to hold up. That was one that I got out of the library. I do think I will buy that at some point, because I would quite like to reread it, because I don't know that I would react the same way. I'd definitely be curious to revisit it. I just haven't had a chance to do that yet. Speaking of books that I'd like to buy that I had out of the library originally, I would also really like to pick up Francis Spufford's Golden Hill, which I thought was kind of ridiculous, but had such a wonderful play with language and with thwarting expectations. But because so many of my reactions to it were about expectations, because you start in one style and it changes styles, and it starts playing into, say, a certain trope, and then it thwarts those expectations as no. So I'd be curious to know how that will reread, because I won't have the same expectations going into it. So I want to call that one of my favorites, because it definitely was as I was reading it, but I don't know how I'm going to feel about that when I read it a second time. So I'll be curious about that. One book that I read early on in the year was Hisham Attar's In the Country of Men. It is about a young boy who is growing up in Libya in the late 70s, and it's about the politics of the time through the eyes of a child. And I think the use of a child narrator here is probably one of the most successful child narrators I have ever read. You definitely hear things through his voice. It never falls into the trap of making him seem either too innocent or too mature, which I think is quite difficult to do, and this does that quite well. This also blew me away with the descriptions of atmosphere. And I don't mean atmosphere in terms of emotional atmosphere, but in terms of the physical space. There are descriptions of being inside a room with the drapes closed on a hot day. There's a description of tar melting on the roof when you're on a roof in full sun at midday that are just spectacular. I thought this was really excellent. And it's one that, even though I read this right at the beginning of the year, I still think about and am quite impressed by. Another book that I read fairly early in the year is Harry Parker's Anatomy of a Soldier. I have reread this since I read it the first time. I wasn't quite as impressed with it when I read it the second time, in part because I knew how the gimmick worked. This is a story where each chapter is completely out of order. I've seen interviews with the author where he says that you can read the chapters in any order. It is the parallel stories of a teenage Afghan insurgent and a 20-something British Army captain. The Afghan boy dies, the British Army captain loses both of his legs. The story is narrated by their things, by their shoes, by medical equipment, by prosthetics and beer glasses and explosive devices. I think it works brilliantly most of the time, but there are a few chapters where it's a bit weaker. As a writing style, I really was impressed by it the first time. I'm still quite impressed by it, although, as I said, I don't think it was quite as successful as I originally thought that it was. But I still think this was more brilliant than not. And it was definitely one of the most interestingly styled books that I read this year. One book that I didn't give 5 stars to, but that I'm still going to list as kind of a favorite of the year, is The Steel Remains by Richard K. Morgan. This is the first book in his A Land Fit for Heroes series. I did read the whole series. This is a piece of grimdark fantasy. It has its flaws. As a piece of grimdark fantasy, it was great fun. It was spectacular. It, was a reasonable length. The third volume, unfortunately, got a bit lengthy and fell into a lot more of the fantasy tropes, but I still overall thought this was a lot of fun to read. This is not a book that I would recommend to everyone because I don't think grimdark is to everyone's taste, because this is a genre that relies on gratuitousness. But it does that gratuitousness fairly well, at least in terms of the violence. On rereading, because I originally read this from the library and then I went out and bought this, I do think the sex scenes are a little ridiculous, and he uses the word prick ad nauseum. You really needed to find some additional words for that. But overall, I still think these were great fun and really plays with expectations. It was not the same old, bitter, angry people who just kill everyone. There was a lot more going on here, and a lot of interesting political world building, which I liked. I think done with layers that you don't always get in this genre, so I really was entertained by this. While I'm sticking to genre pieces, I also really loved Midnighter and Apollo, which is a collection of the 6-issue miniseries. This was written by Steve Orlando and drawn by Fernando Blanco. It is kind of ridiculous. Apollo dies and goes to hell, and Midnighter saves him. He rips up demons. Being a mainstream DC Universe book, it's rated T, so this is not a mature reader's book, but it genuinely takes the violence right to the borderline of, I think, what they can get away with. So again, this is not a book that's going to be for everyone, but if you do like this kind of grim superhero book, I think this is spectacular. I have complained quite a lot about writers not doing interesting things when they have the opportunity to reinvent characters. And I know I complained about these particular characters in the New 52 Stormwatch, but I really do think that once Steve Orlando started writing these characters in the 12-issue Midnighter series and then in this series, he really did some interesting things with them. He also rehabs Extraño, who was the most stereotypical character ever, and turns him into something interesting. So there's that too. This is great fun. And finally, my favorite book of this year was Tracey Lindberg's Birdie. This is very loosely a story, although it's very non-linear. So again, this is one that I might not recommend to everyone, in this case because of this style of storytelling. But I thought this was a spectacular journey through someone's psyche. This is a very sad story about a woman who has really been broken down by life and by a constant cycle of abuse and real poverty and misery. And she lives in northern Alberta, and she's from a Cree family that doesn't have status, so they're not entitled to housing on the reserve. And she eventually ends up in foster care in Edmonton. And from these kind of grim beginnings, you have this journey that she makes where she goes off to BC because she's obsessed with this actor from the Beachcombers, and that almost sounds like a joke, but it doesn't play out that way. And eventually she has family and a friend who are going to look after her as she goes through what might be a kind of nervous breakdown after this lifetime of abuse. and she's there in BC and she's not eating, and she's maybe getting in touch with her inner bird, her inner owl, so that she can revisit her past and really come to terms with it. And yeah, it's just spectacular. A brilliant bit of storytelling and writing and character piece that it really had everything. So definitely, I think, both the best and my favorite thing that I read this year. Or last year, because it is January now. So that was my year. I hope you had a happy new year. That's it for now. Ciao.